Hey guys, welcome to the Nexus Resilience panel about Keralans being allies. My name is Jens Jacob. I'm a producer based in LA. And with me, I have Sonja Thomas, who is an author and associate professor in women's gender studies. Sini Stephan, who's an educator and activist, and Stephan Olikara, who's founder and president of Millennial Action Project. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Nexus, for having us. Yeah, I thought I'd kick this off with just kind of like what the conversation is going to steer around, which is, I think one of the biggest topics this year has kind of been a cultural climate around what has happened around the Black community and just where conversations have steered as far as what that looks like to support the conversation or not, especially as brown people, where usually it ends up being a black and white conversation. And we're always trying to find out where we kind of fit in what we should or shouldn't talk about, or how we should have the conversation and how it affects us and how we can support others. So my first question, and feel free to anybody can answer and bounce around. We probably will step on each other. But for all of you guys, what does it mean to be an ally? It's kind of a broad term, but can you guys describe what it means for you to be an ally?
I think, in this specific context that you're talking about, Jens, I think being an ally means, standing with communities that have been marginalized and using the resources we have available to ourselves and the relationships we have to be of service to those communities. And those communities might be directly in our domain and in our extended family, or it could be a completely different community, such as the Black community. But I really think that our community has a unique role in all of this because we can be an ally, in some ways a bridge in this conversation with a number of different groups. And when I was, currently I'm in the political bridge building space, but prior to this, I was in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And I noticed that because of my skin color, and because of my upbringing as an Indian American in a suburban Milwaukee community, largely white, largely conservative, being a minority in that space, but also having the unique experience that's being Indian American, it gives you a unique vantage point to have conversations across race, across the Black-white divide. And I think that we have a responsibility to be active participants in that conversation, but also to be active listeners as well. So I'm a jazz musician, I use a lot of music metaphors, and I think listening is the most important skill in being a musician, but also the most important skill in being an ally as well.
So cool, you're gonna have to play us something later.
Sure.
I know, Steve, we have to talk because I'm a tap dancer.
Oh, nice. I like that. Nice.
Oh.
I can go next too. Just to add on to what Steve was saying, the brown people in the United States, and especially immigrants and children of immigrants and third generation children of immigrants, participate in settler colonialism, right? And because we want to live this American dream. And so when we do that, when we come in here, we don't realize that the United States in and of itself is a settler colonial country that has been built on the backs of slaves, enslaved peoples, and has been built on the backs of genocide of Native peoples. And that's why we say Black, Indigenous, and people of color, so that we recognize the specific things that have happened to Black people and Indigenous people in this country. And so I think a lot of times Indian Americans don't think about this. I'm a college professor, and what I study is the caste privilege of many Kerala-Christians. And when we come over, many people who come over from India into the second and third generation come with caste privilege. And caste privilege itself tends to be forming ideas of anti-Blackness in our very communities. So when we come in as people of color, we're often assumed to be, minoritized individuals, and we don't see our own privileges. The vast majority of Malayalis in the United States are caste privileged, and the vast majority of peoples who are Malayali in the United States are Christians. And so if you put those caste and Christian privilege together, we have a role that is not exactly always the subordinated peoples. We tend to be that model minority. And so to recognize our class privilege, our caste privilege, or racial privilege is the first step, I think, to be a true ally. Now, not all of us might have those privileges, but when the vast majority does, that which we say as Indian or Indian Christian needs to be unpacked before we can really become true allies. I'm also a feminist scholar, so I always go off of Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality. You can't be an ally unless you're thinking about the intersections of gender and race, of sexuality and race. And that's why we say her name, and that's why we say Black trans lives matter.
Yeah, Sonja, I'm really excited that you mentioned that we do have privilege, right? As people of color, as South Indian Americans, we move through the world with both privilege and oppression. And so we have to understand the duality of our positionality in the racial hierarchy that exists in the United States. And as you mentioned, Black and Indigenous people have suffered the greatest, right? So when we put our identity into the American framework, we are experiencing a different levels of racism, right? That do exist, right? And Black and Indigenous people have endured far greater levels of oppression in the American context than Indian Americans, right? And so with that to say, I think what they're calling it now, instead of ally, they're calling it co-conspirator, to be a co-conspirator in being able to, join hands with our Black and Indigenous brothers and sisters so that we can mobilize our own community to speak up for the cause. That is not to say that we can, dismantle white supremacy and white supremacist structures so easily. We have to do the work. And to all the people who are wanting to be allies or wanting to be a co-conspirator, I would say that the education or the research that is required to understand the racial history of the United States and breaking down those white supremacist structures really rest on us to do that education and that research. So I would advise that we don't, ask Black or Indigenous people for advice on how to do it or how to dismantle the system, because we have to do that education ourselves. And at this time in 2020, a lot of Black and Indigenous communities are grieving right now. So it's really important to recognize our positionality and make sure that we take ownership of our responsibility as a community with privilege.
Wow, so true. I'm going to kind of like steer the conversation a little bit to like issues, I guess, like within our own community. One thing that I noticed particularly this year, and I could even say that I was even a part of the problem that I kind of became more self-aware of this year, was just how apathetic like our community was to like specific injustices or things that were coming up, or a fear of speaking out about something like that. Where do you guys think that the apathy comes from? Is that like culturally ingrained? Is that historic? Like, is that just who we are? Like, where does that come from?
Well, I think, speaking, if we're going to go on this track of also speaking about privilege, when we talk about white privilege, we say like white silence is violence, right? We recognize the fact that those with privilege have the privilege to not say anything. And so when it's not affecting us, it's easy to think that it's not that big of a problem. So I think maybe one of the things that if we're saying apathy, it's also, well, it doesn't affect me. I don't really see that as a problem. My parents came over here and worked hard, so why can't everybody else? Without mentioning the fact that my father came over as a doctor with all the privileges in the world, right? Like, so I think that that's one thing about issues of apathy. I think another thing is When you live in the same enclaves, I did not grow up in a Malayali community. I grew up in a very rural area of eastern Montana. And so I'm very surprised. My parents were very politically always voting, always, like telling us about issues of racial injustice. So perhaps when you're around a community, and if they're not talking about it, it takes a lot of strength to start those conversations, because the inertia is there to not have them, right? So if we're always in the same communities and not making alliances to Black Lives Matter, to different other groups, racial groups, I think that requires a lot of heavy lifting. Otherwise, that apathy comes in.
Yeah. So I made a couple observations this past year with the Malayali community in Greater Milwaukee. One was that I noticed the Malayali aunties were highly engaged and kind of tuned in to what was going on. A lot of conversation going on, WhatsApp groups. Not that I was on these groups, but they were reported to me, and I think there was like an interest, a desire to be involved in change, but perhaps looking for what the right avenues were for mobilization and activism. And that relates to the other point that transcends even this past year, which is I think there's a norm in our community not to make our voices heard on politically divisive issues. I mean, just think about it as a matter of career track. When I was, in high school and going to college, the idea of being involved in politics and public service was, in the words of my father, a nice hobby to have on the side, but not a thing that you can do, with your profession. And so, when you're constantly told to just, do your homework well, don't, ruffle any feathers and go to med school, then, that doesn't condition you for truly stepping out into some of these difficult political conversations and raising your voices. So I think there is a cultural and normative change that we need to make, but fortunately, at least from my observation, I think it is changing, especially with the younger generation, as we become more and more comfortable in spaces to speak out. But I think we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, I definitely agree. In alignment with what Sonja and Stephan were saying, there's definitely a level of privilege that we have as first and second generation South Indian Americans, right? We have to recognize that our parents as immigrants, they were in survival mode. They had to make sure that there was food on the table, that we were financially stable. These are things that they were worried about, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So we have the privilege because we were given an education, and we got to go as a South Indian American population. We're one of the most educated people racially in the United States. And there are several reasons for that, is because of the opportunities that we had to immigrate here, the Hart-Celler Act in 1965 that was passed. But we also have to understand and be conscious and aware of our internalized racism, right? Because as people who have experienced British colonialism, we have a lot of self-hatred and internalized racism that's invested in our bodies, in our minds, and in the way that we approach the world. So being able to be cognizant of that and fight against that is very important, because if we don't do the internal work of undoing the internalized racism and self-hatred, we're not going to get to the place of liberation, which is essentially what we want on a larger scale. But going back to that level of entrenched colonization that we still experience as a people, it's also important to know that with British colonialism, we have the privilege that other groups of people have not had, right? And without that internal work, we're not going to be able to move forward.
Right. I think this year, a lot of people, and Steve, you were kind of like hinting at this, like there was something about this year specifically that kind of woke a lot of people up or enabled. I mean, I've now become a part of a Facebook group called Millennials for Black Lives Matter, which I never thought I would ever be a part of, like, you know, which is so
Sonia
cool.
and I are part of that too.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like, I just looked at it the other day and there's like 10,000 people in it. I was just like, wow, like this is unbelievable. And I'm just like curious, like was there for you guys, like, I know, like for me, like I grew up mostly conservative. So there was a distinct point in my life where I've had to make the choice. Sonja, you sound like you've probably been more, you grew up in it because your family maybe was a little bit more liberal or leaning towards like social justice. Like Steve or Sini, like, or even for Sonja, like, was there a specific story or a moment for you guys, whether that revolved around your own personal story around race or a public story that's kind of come out in news that has kind of led you to a life of activism and being an ally?
Well,
I mean,
I think my experience is a little different because I grew up in a very predominantly white place. I went to college in Minneapolis and I spent some time in New York City, but then I moved to another predominantly white space. I live in central Maine, the whitest state in the nation. So most of the people I've always grown up with have been white. And I have always walked into the room and been the only person of color, mistaken for a Black person a lot because my name's Sonja with a J and Thomas, I think, and, you know, called the N-word. So I think it's a little bit different than for people who have experiences in suburbs or urban areas of this country. But that said, I would say, like, it's my experience has always been that we need to fight racism. We need to fight racism and sexism and the intersections of it. I don't know that it was exactly my upbringing or my parents or any one thing. Just seeing any kind of injustice in the world makes me have a little fire underneath me. And I feel like that's why I dedicated my life to education, that if we don't have that fire, what are we doing? Like, what are we doing in life if you can walk by injustice and not fight it? This is something that we all need to understand then. As Sini was saying in her comments, it's up to us to educate ourselves then. And if I can help educate others, I'll do that.
Wow.
yeah, that resonates with me as well. I think, you know, I grew up in a fairly apolitical family, so it was through a lot of external experiences that I decided to get engaged. And I think there's a connection between the upbringing, where I know what it feels like to be an outcast and be dissimilar from everyone else around me, and to be walking down a street late at night and for people to mistake me for being a Black person, and to see what that racism looks like, to see someone just abruptly move to the other side of the street because they think I'm a threat to them of some kind. So knowing what that experience is like, and then trying to find ways to channel that. So before I got involved in politics, it was all about music, and my bands were like motley crews of, you know, people of every type of race. And when, you know, I think about my hip hop band, for example, we had people from the inner city, we had people from the conservative, some of the most conservative suburbs. And I remember we would play these shows and people would just be like, their mind like had trouble processing what they were seeing on stage racially and socially, given the mashup of perspectives and identities that were at play. But through music, I saw how that diversity could lead to better forms of art if constructively brought together. And I wanted to then try and find a political expression for that, because I think, you know, our democracy, it's as diverse and messy as it is. It's beautiful in that we can at times find ways to build constructive bridges of understanding and cooperation. And that's ultimately what led to, you know, founding Millennial Action Project, which engages our youngest elected officials around this type of consciousness of, you know, what Dr. King described as radical love. And, you know, he had this great line about, and Sonja, you're speaking to this, about how injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so I remember when I saw that line on the Dr. King Memorial and seeing the year that was underneath it, when all of those words spoken were in his 20s and 30s, it gave me a fire that, let's not wait, 10 years when it's easier to work on these issues. The time is now when I'm I'm young, I'm in my 20s, and I have this consciousness of trying to change our politics. And that gave me, I think, a boost to really jump into this and realize that, life is short. So we don't have time to do anything that isn't purposeful for us.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we as a community, as a Malayali community, are responsible to take on this anti-racism stance, right? And to work for an anti-racist world, because there would be no Malayali American community if it wasn't for the entire civil rights movement, which was all led by Black and Indigenous people. I mean, so we have to recognize that we would literally not be existent in this country as Malayali Americans, as first gen or second gen Indian, South Indian Americans at all. We wouldn't even be existent in this country without the work of Black and Indigenous people. So that's the first thing to recognize. When you were speaking about apathy, because I lost my train of thought earlier, was last time when Nexus had done a live with Deepa Iyer, she spoke about the racial hierarchy that exists and how as a community, we aspire to whiteness. And it's not because we want to be quote unquote white, but we aspire to what whiteness represents. And that is money, power, status, being able to make decisions in this country that shape economics, shape the government, all of those things. So we do have a responsibility. And when I was younger, I did grow up in a predominantly Black community in Mount Vernon. And then I moved immediately to a predominantly white area. So it was like a stark contrast for me, but I still remember one time coming home, this is when we were in Mount Vernon, a predominantly Black community, and I don't know who it was, one of my family members, my amachira touching was like, Karaman Arkaroda, like Kalikilla, like don't play with, like, I was a little girl, so I was, don't play with Black or brown people, right? And I was like, what do you mean? I just like retorted back because I was in 4th grade. I was like, no, I was like, namala like ellarium unna, or like I was like, God created us one or something like that. I like retorted back, but it's deeply entrenched. Even from a young age, like we have to separate ourselves from what is Black or separate ourselves from what is Latinx, right? Because we are quote unquote better than, right? There's this aspect like we have to aspire to be better than these other quote unquote races, because our community, even though a lot of our parents did not receive a higher education, or some of us did not receive a higher education, they are still aware of the racial hierarchy exists, and that means power. So when you have a lack of power results in lack of opportunity. And so our parents were trying to shield us from that. And because of that, our community historically has practiced anti-Blackness, right? And so we have to make sure that we are breaking that down, especially for the next generation that's moving forward. It's really critical.
So true. What do you, I try to, as much as possible, decouple the idea of anything's Black or white or binary or anything like that. It seems like most Malayali, I would even say maybe Malayali Christians that I know aren't necessarily racist, if we like go with the term of like what race this is, but like almost still won't like necessarily like go there when we're talking about like allyship. And maybe if I drill it down even further, like to a specific that's happened this year, which is like essentially Black Lives Matter, the statement became something that was a form of showing allyship, but then got conflated with most conservatives that the organization wasn't necessarily what the term meant, and for whatever reason people are afraid to say it. How do you talk to somebody that does share that viewpoint, that agrees with the statement that Black Lives Matter, but is afraid to say it because of an organization and what they stand for. Because it seems like to me, most people are looking out of not a political lens, maybe like a lens of left and right than they are even black and white.
I mean,
Sorry, I know that's heavy. I apologize.
No. So the Black Lives Matter organization is different from the Black Lives Matter movement, right? The Black Lives Matter organization, or the movement itself, began in 2013 after in 2012 when Trayvon Martin was killed, right? So when we look at the progression of how the movement has manifested in the United States and taken form, you can still be part of the movement and not directly be associated with Black Lives Matter, the organization. So there's a distinction that needs to be made there. But yeah, I don't know if Sonja and Stephen have anything to add.
It angers me to no end where we're saying where anybody could say something to the fact like this has become too political and I'm scared of it. The only reason that it's quote unquote political is because white supremacy is so deep in this country. And right now, one political party is speaking to that, right? Like when known white supremacists find a voice in a particular political candidate, that means that something like Black Lives Matter seems like it's political, but this is not political, okay? To be anti-racist is not a Democrat thing or a Republican thing. To be for Black lives means that you don't want them murdered, right? So that's not political. I find this as an educator, we do this, this kind of conspiracy that comes into higher education about so-called free speech, that we need to have another side of the equation. And you see that the people who are really attacked in higher education are feminist, anti-racist scholars. And I always come into my students and say, I teach and research the intersections of caste, gender, and race. There's nothing political about that. But when you have a country like India that doesn't require that you learn Ambedkar or about any Dalit lives, then to teach about Dalit lives seems political. When you have a country like the United States where we don't have any museums documenting the brutal history of slavery and genocide of Native Americans, and then you go and try and teach about settler colonialism, it feels like you're doing something political. It's not political. It's the fact that white supremacy is so deeply ingrained in our country that it affects what we display in museums and what we don't, how we describe things in libraries and don't, what we teach and what we don't. What's very clear to me is that I have 18-year-olds coming into my classroom almost in tears that they've never read any Black woman in their lives. And they read Patricia Hill Collins for the first time and says, this makes sense to me. Why aren't we teaching the fact that, let's say, Black women faced massive amounts of sterilization, and there was a history of the eugenics movement and sterilization abuse? How can't we learn about these things so that we can contextualize why people are saying that Black Lives Matter also? So I don't know exactly how to answer your question, Jen, because to me, this is not anything that we should be fearful of. And if it is fearful, it's because we have so lived in a country where white supremacy is the norm, and it shapes our political system, it shapes our education system, it shapes our churches. Part of the research that I'm working on right now is how Christianity has had a long history of being complicit in white supremacy and settler colonialism. Right. And so if we don't know that, if you look at parish histories in Montana, nothing mentioned about Black people or settler colonialism or Native lives. Well, then, like Sini said, we have to educate ourselves, but then also that's the reason that it's considered scary, because the status quo is a white supremacist status quo. So if you're scared to say even the words Black Lives Matter, just to recognize, Sini mentioned the word Karambi too. I think it's really important to mention the types of language that we use. If we're fearful of saying something, then to break it down and educate ourselves and say, where does that fear come from? if we're saying the word Garambi and we're not afraid to say that. I just heard an administrator use the word pariah. This is a Dalit caste in Kerala, the pariah caste, that we just like throw out, oh, I'm a pariah, right? In the English language, like break down our very words. I think that that's maybe a first step to get over that fear.
So good.
Yeah. It was interesting to watch this past year as we talked about Black Lives Matter and our willingness to stand with the community, because in Wisconsin, Black Lives Matter went from being majority support in June, I think it was about 52, 55%. That's when Mitt Romney came out in support. And I was like, wow, this is definitely seeming to be a tipping point. And then as you got into the fall, it dipped under 50%. And the problem with watching the polls like that is seeing how people, when things become more popular, decide to stand on the side of racial justice. And then when it becomes less popular and more controversial, people become more afraid. And it reminds me of one thing that Dr. King said, which is the time is always right to do what is right, regardless of the polling. And we know that in the history of in the American experience with race, that equality and justice has always started off as a fringe movement, and then we've grown support, and ideally you grow enough support to make institutional as well as cultural changes. So it's, we can look back at history and see what choices were right, which choices were most courageous, and see how that applies to our current circumstances. And so if I think we look at it through that lens, I think there's no choice other than being on the side of right, even when that's difficult. When whether it was during the time of slavery or Jim Crow, there were people who were willing to stick their necks out, people who had relative privilege, who were willing to stick their necks out and help to move the conversation. And I think that's our responsibility today, even as we see the polling change on this. It shouldn't matter what the polling is. The time is always right to do what is right. So
true. I think we've run out of time. I feel like we can go another 3 hours because I have way more questions. But thank you all. I mean, it's just been an honor to learn even a little bit from you guys, and I hope the conversation continues. Does anybody have any maybe next step practice, something, I guess, obviously this is a part of our audience's way of learning and educating themselves. Is there any actionable steps that you guys feel like that one can take? Does it need to look like activism? Is there something else that's like a step towards what that looks like to help be an ally?
I'll name 4 really easy things. First of all, you can join a group like Malayalis for Black Lives Matter. Yeah. They're on Facebook, join it, right? Number 2, we all have our own enclaves that we probably don't think of it as an enclave, but it is just a hop, skip, and a jump to have your, youth group in your church ally themselves with a group that's for Black lives. You can do this so easily. So to think of our own groups in our own communities. A third thing is get involved and vote. Know your politicians, your local politicians, your state and our federal government. Just stay informed. And the 4th thing I would say is, this is so important for any parents out there. Get diverse books in the classroom. Argue in your schools for diverse books.
Wow, I never even thought about that last one. So good.
I've got three steps, just building on what Sonja said. One is acknowledge how those in political power are using narrative and media to manipulate our minds right now, and often see the worst in the other side, however you define the other side. And that is what helps to create this politics of hatred, politics of contempt. And it's very, very destructive. And the sooner that we can realize that, the quicker we can try and change our mindset. The second step I would say is choose empathy. And I often liken empathy to muscle building, because in politics, there are so many forces against having empathy and compassion with people who have a different experience than us. But I believe that our democracy requires us to listen to and choose empathy for people's lived experiences. And the third thing I would say is directly support leaders who have this type of consciousness that we're talking about for public office. There are real choices in our politics, and voting is a prerequisite. I will say it doesn't stop with voting, because after the vote has happened, you have to continue to hold our elected officials accountable. And in the absence of us making our voices heard, there's a void where a lot of special interests and the status quo will largely run the game. And so we have to make sure that we're supporting candidates for office who believe in racial justice and are holding those elected officials accountable after the election. And then the final thing, especially for our community, is just see the unique responsibility we have to be a bridge in these conversations. I think the fact that we have Christian faith in many ways, as we've talked about, is a privilege, but it's also an opportunity to have conversations with people who might not otherwise be in this conversation. And then finally, get out of this norm that we have to be quiet. We got to raise our voices and see that this country is part of our responsibility to make it what it ought to be.
Yeah, I mean, everything what Sonja and Stephen had said, be aware of your own complicity, educate yourself, and call out racism. I mean, this is a Keralan-Christian organization, right? So Christians are supposed to be aware, right? This is a human rights issue. That's really what it comes down to. And if you don't support Black lives, then you have a lot of work to do. And you know, it's also a lot of, it's Black lives, Indigenous lives, and a lot of historic undoing that we have to participate in and be aware of.
Amazing. Well, thank you all for giving us a little bit of wisdom, and thank you, Nexus, for allowing the conversation to happen.